They say once you walk through the gates of Parchman Prison, you never come back the same. In the heart of the Mississippi Delta, past the cotton fields and long stretches of dirt road, stands a place so feared that even hardened inmates whisper its name. Unit 29. It's the cell block where men vanish into the system, where nights stretch forever, and where the line between survival and madness disappears. In January 2020, chaos erupted behind these walls, a week of violence that left bodies, blood, and questions the state still hasn't answered. What happened inside that cell block? Why did the system break? And how did Parchman become one of the most dangerous prisons in America? This is Inside Parchman Prison, the untold truth about Mississippi's most dangerous cell block. It's 5:47 a.m., January 3rd, 2020. Inside Unit 29, the air is heavy and stale. Power has been flickering all night. Toilets overflow. The smell of sewage fills the dorm. A group of inmates pound on the door, yelling for help. But no one comes. Moments later, a fight breaks out. A handmade blade flashes. Someone screams. Within seconds, the entire dorm erupts. Mattresses are set on fire. Black smoke curls through the vents. Guards rush in, outnumbered and unprepared. Radios blare with emergency calls. By sunrise, the smoke has cleared, but the floor is slick with blood and water. 4 inmates are dead. Several more are injured. The prison goes into full lockdown. News travels fast outside the gates. Riot at Parchman Prison. But what the headlines don't show is what led to this moment. Because this wasn't just a riot. It was a warning. To understand how Unit 29 exploded, we have to go back, long before the fire, long before the screams, to when Parchman was first built. That's where the real story begins. To understand what happened inside Unit 29, we have to go back more than a century, to when Parchman was first built. Parchman wasn't designed like an ordinary prison. When it opened in 1901, it was called the Farm. Thousands of acres of land in Sunflower County, Mississippi, surrounded by barbed wire, shotgun towers, and endless rows of cotton. It wasn't just a prison. It was a plantation reborn. After the Civil War, Mississippi needed labor to rebuild its economy. The answer was convict leasing, a brutal system that allowed the state to rent prisoners to private farms and businesses. Most of those prisoners were black men, arrested for small or fabricated crimes. When leasing became too controversial, the state brought the labor back home, to Parchman. Inside those fields, prisoners worked from sunrise to sunset, watched by armed guards on horseback. If you couldn't meet your quota, you were whipped. If you spoke out, you were sent to the hole, a small concrete box with no light, no air, and no mercy. By the 20th century, Parchman had become a symbol of fear across the South. For decades, stories leaked out. Men dying in the fields, others disappearing altogether. In the 1960s, during the Civil Rights era, activists arrested in protests were sent here too. They called it the closest thing to slavery that ever existed in America. And even after the whips and fields were gone, the system that built Parchman stayed alive, through neglect, overcrowding, and violence. The walls were still cracking. The roofs still leaking. The water still unsafe to drink. Decade after decade, Mississippi promised change. But by the time the 2000s came, one building at Parchman stood out above all the rest. A cell block so violent, so chaotic, even guards called it cursed. That building was Unit 29. And by the late 2010s, it had become a powder keg waiting to explode. When the news cameras left Parchman, the stories didn't stop. They just got quieter, passed from cell to cell, written in letters that would later leak to the outside world. Letters from men trapped inside Unit 29. They talked about sleeping on concrete floors because their bunks were broken, about toilets that overflowed for days, about rats and snakes crawling through the cracks in the walls, about nights so dark you couldn't tell if your eyes were open. One man wrote, "They call this a prison, but it feels like a graveyard." Another said, "You either fight or you fade." Inside Unit 29, survival meant forming alliances. You had to pick a side, not because you wanted to, but because being alone meant being prey. Some men joined groups for protection. Others stayed quiet and prayed they'd make it through another night. Fights broke out over food, over space, over nothing at all. And each time, guards came late, sometimes not at all. By 2019, the tension had reached a breaking point. Several men had already died that year from stabbings, heat, or illness. The Mississippi Department of Corrections was short on staff, running low on funds, and struggling to control its most volatile unit. And when one guard finally did speak out, he said something that chilled reporters to the bone. Unit 29 isn't a place you work, it's a place you survive. Still, outside those gates, the public barely knew what was happening. There were no cameras, no press tours, no transparency. Until January 2020, when everything changed. That's when a fight that started between two men in one cell turned into a chain reaction across the entire unit. Dozens of inmates joined in, some trying to protect themselves, others using the chaos as revenge. The lights went out, the doors jammed, and for the next several hours, Unit 29 became a war zone. When daylight returned, the walls were blackened, the floors flooded, and bodies lay in silence. 5 men were dead, dozens injured. The images that leaked online would shock the world. But what followed was even more disturbing, because instead of closing Unit 29, Mississippi tried to contain the story. They locked it down. No phones, no visitors, no voices. And yet, the truth still found its way out. Through letters, smuggled photos, and secret recordings, the world would finally see what really happened inside Mississippi's most dangerous cell block. After the smoke cleared and the blood was washed from the floors, officials promised answers. They said the violence inside Parchman Prison would be investigated, that justice would be served. But what they found inside Unit 29 stunned even the people who thought they'd seen it all. Federal investigators from the U.S. Department of Justice arrived at Parchman in early 2020. They walked through the same rusted gates, past the barbed wire, into a world that felt frozen in time. What they saw was chaos, cells with no lights, walls covered in mold, toilets filled to the brim, water so brown it wasn't drinkable. Inmates told investigators about nights without electricity, days without running water, and weeks without medical care. Some said they were left in cells with no mattresses, no blankets, and no hope. The DOJ's report described extreme, unconstitutional conditions. They found that Mississippi had failed to protect inmates from violence, failed to provide proper medical and mental health care, and failed to maintain even the most basic standards of safety. One investigator later said, "It wasn't just neglect, it was abandonment." Photos leaked online showed what words couldn't capture. Ceiling holes big enough for rain to pour through, flooded hallways, broken locks, and messages scratched into the walls by men desperate to be heard. One photo showed a short sentence written in pencil, "Nobody cares if we die here." Outside the prison, families of inmates began to protest. Mothers stood in the cold with signs that read, "Close Unit 29." Civil rights attorneys joined in. Rappers and activists used their platforms to call out Mississippi's broken prison system. In 2021, lawsuits piled up, demanding accountability. And slowly, the state began to feel the pressure. Officials promised to close Unit 29 temporarily. They said repairs were coming. But inside the walls, men were still living in darkness, moved from one broken cell to another. Some guards quit. Others stayed, saying they couldn't abandon the few who still trusted them. And through it all, the voices from inside never stopped. Letters kept arriving, each one painting the same picture. A place where time stands still, where cries for help echo off the concrete and fade into silence. Parchman wasn't just a prison anymore. It had become a symbol of everything that can go wrong when a system forgets the people inside it. When federal investigators returned to Parchman months later, they expected slow progress, maybe a few repairs, maybe some policy changes. But what they found inside Unit 29 was far from improvement. The unit was quieter, yes, but not safer. The smell of rot still filled the halls. Electrical wires still dangled from the ceilings. And deep inside one of the closed-off wings, investigators made a disturbing discovery. They found entire sections of the building that had been sealed off, hidden from view, blocked by welded doors. Inside were abandoned cells filled with trash, old mattresses, and personal belongings left behind by inmates who'd either been moved or never recorded at all. In one cell, a Bible was open on the floor, pages damp and torn. On the wall, a sentence written in faint ink, "We beg them to see us." Records showed that these cells had been uninhabited for months, yet food trays and blankets were found inside. Nobody could explain how they got there. When investigators compared logbooks, they found inconsistencies, missing names, unrecorded movements, and shifts that didn't match the official schedule. It raised a chilling question. Were some inmates being kept off the books? The Department of Corrections denied it immediately. They said the notes were clerical errors, nothing more. But the timing, right after the riots and the federal investigation, made many doubt that answer. As the truth began to spread, media outlets started digging deeper. Leaked photos and letters confirmed that Unit 29 hadn't really changed. In fact, some said conditions were worse than before. Inmates still described days without running water. Families still couldn't reach their loved ones. And the temporary closure that had been promised? It never fully happened. Civil rights lawyers demanded answers. Human rights groups compared Parchman to a modern-day dungeon. And soon, the case of Unit 29 reached national headlines. For the first time, people across the United States were seeing what Mississippi had tried to keep hidden. Parchman was no longer a secret. It was a scandal. And yet, inside those walls, life went on. The men still woke to the same cracked ceilings. They still slept through nights filled with screams and prayers. One inmate wrote in his final letter before transfer, "We are alive, but we are ghosts. Nobody on the outside believes what we see every day." For a while, it seemed like the noise around Parchman was fading. The news cycle had moved on. But inside those cracked walls, nothing had changed. And then, late one humid night in the summer of 2022, the silence was broken again. An inmate named Terrence T. Johnson was found unresponsive in his cell inside Unit 29. The official report said medical emergency, but the men housed near him told a different story. They said T had begged for medical attention for days. They said he had a fever, trouble breathing, and no one came. When guards finally opened the door, it was too late. Word spread fast through the cell block, banging on doors, shouts echoing through the night. By morning, the entire unit was in chaos again, not a riot, but a roar of anger and exhaustion. T's death hit differently because he wasn't violent. He was serving a short sentence, almost done with his time. He'd told people he wanted to see his daughter when he got out. That made his death a spark. Within days, families of other inmates started posting online photos, letters, stories. The hashtag Justice for Parchman began to trend. Reporters returned to Mississippi. Cameras rolled again outside the gates. Mothers cried in front of microphones, saying their sons were living in conditions worse than animals. The pressure grew. The governor ordered another review. Federal attorneys revisited their case. Celebrities and activists spoke out, calling Parchman America's forgotten hell. For the first time, Mississippi's leaders couldn't hide. The world was watching. Inside Unit 29, inmates could feel the change, small but real. Lights that hadn't worked in years flickered back on. Pipes were replaced. New staff arrived. But hope was fragile. Because as one inmate wrote in a letter to his mother, they fix what the cameras can see. The rest stays the same. And in many ways, he was right. The problems ran deeper than any repair job. They were built into the foundation. The same foundation laid when Parchman was born on a plantation more than a century ago. It was a quiet afternoon in Unit 29. Guards were stretched thin, inmates restless, and the heat in the dorms was nearly unbearable. Then, in a moment that seemed impossible, a small group of inmates executed a plan months in the making. They pried open a section of the cell door with tools they had hidden for weeks. They coordinated movements with signals only they understood. And in less than 10 minutes, 5 men had escaped their cells. The alarms sounded instantly. Guards scrambled. Doors slammed shut. But the chaos had already begun. Other inmates used the confusion to fight for control over the dorms. Smoke alarms blared. Water sprinklers flooded the halls. The echoes of shouts, banging, and screaming filled the corridors. Outside the prison, news spread like wildfire. Reporters rushed to the gates. Families of inmates feared the worst. Social media exploded with speculation. How could this happen at one of the country's most notorious prisons? Inside, the escapees didn't get far. Most were recaptured within hours, but the damage had been done. The incident exposed shocking truths. Security cameras had blind spots. Staffing was inadequate. Procedures that should have prevented such a breach weren't being followed. Federal investigators returned once again. Lawmakers demanded accountability. And for the men trapped inside Unit 29, it became clear Survival wasn't just about avoiding fights or illness anymore. It was about outsmarting a system that had already failed them. One inmate later said in a letter, "We didn't escape for freedom. We escaped to be seen, to be heard." The Great Escape became a symbol, not of success, but of the desperation and neglect inside Unit 29. Months after the Great Escape, the walls of Unit 29 began to whisper their truth in a way the public could no longer ignore. A former prison clerk leaked hundreds of pages of internal records, documents showing what the state had tried desperately to hide. They revealed a shocking pattern: deaths and serious injuries that were never reported, fights that were covered up or misclassified, medical neglect so severe that inmates who begged for help were left untreated, sometimes until it was too late. One report listed over 30 incidents in a single year where inmates were injured in fights, yet no disciplinary action or investigation took place. Another detailed how plumbing issues, broken doors, and faulty locks were ignored for months, even years, putting men's lives at risk every day. But the most damning evidence? Records showing that prison officials had known for years that Unit 29 was dangerous beyond measure and had done little to fix it. Lawyers, human rights organizations, and reporters pounced on the leak. The documents painted a grim picture: a system built on neglect, fear, and profit. And for the first time, the world could see the scale of the disaster. Families of inmates were outraged. Activists called for criminal investigations, and national media ran stories with headlines like, "Mississippi's most dangerous prison cellblock exposed." Inside Unit 29, inmates were shaken. Some cried, some laughed bitterly, saying, "They're finally admitting what we've been living for years." But one thing was clear: the spotlight had changed the game. For the first time, it seemed like justice might actually arrive. With the leaked records sending shockwaves across Mississippi and the nation, the next step was uncovering who knew what and when. A handful of brave whistleblowers came forward: former guards, medical staff, and even mid-level prison administrators. One former guard described Unit 29 as a place no one wants to be and no one wants to admit exists. He revealed how supervisors ignored repeated complaints about flooding, broken locks, and unreported fights. He described nights when inmates screamed for help while cameras and intercoms went offline. And he admitted he was ordered not to report certain incidents, to keep statistics low and avoid scrutiny. Another whistleblower, a retired nurse, spoke about medical neglect that went far beyond neglect. Prisoners were denied treatment for broken bones, infections, and severe illnesses. She said she witnessed guards delay or deny care for men who begged for it, knowing it could lead to death. Emails and internal memos corroborated their accounts. Warnings about dangerous conditions were repeatedly ignored. Reports of stabbings and assaults were minimized or erased. Funding requests to repair roofs, plumbing, and wiring were denied or delayed. The stories painted a picture of systemic failure, not just a bad cell block, but an entire culture of cover-ups and negligence. The whistleblowers risked their careers, their safety, and their reputations to expose the truth. And slowly, their courage brought the story of Unit 29 to the world stage. For the first time, politicians, journalists, and the public could see the human cost of Parchman Prison. It wasn't just numbers in a spreadsheet. It was men trapped in concrete boxes, struggling to survive every day. Once the whistleblowers came forward and the leaked documents spread, the story of Unit 29 could no longer be ignored. Civil rights attorneys filed multiple lawsuits against the Mississippi Department of Corrections, demanding accountability for the years of abuse, neglect, and deaths inside the cell block. Families of inmates joined in, sharing heartbreaking testimonies about sons, fathers, and brothers lost or permanently injured. Federal investigators reopened cases. Congressional representatives demanded hearings. National media outlets ran exposés, calling Unit 29 a human rights crisis hidden in plain sight. Courtroom after courtroom revealed shocking truths. Officers had falsified reports to hide stabbings and fights. Critical repairs had been delayed for decades despite repeated warnings. Prisoners' complaints were ignored until tragedies occurred. The governor of Mississippi faced immense pressure. For the first time, officials publicly acknowledged that Unit 29 had failed the men it held, and the state had failed its own laws and standards. The legal battles were just beginning, But the public outrage forced real change. Some repairs were made. Some guards were replaced. Some top administrators resigned or were investigated. Yet inside Unit 29, the scars remained. The walls still carried the echoes of screams. The floors still told the stories of desperation. And the men who survived every day knew that justice might take years, if it ever came at all. Just when it seemed Mississippi was finally forced to take responsibility, new documents revealed a shocking plan. The state had quietly begun relocating high-risk inmates from Unit 29 to other sections of Parchman, and in some cases, to other prisons entirely. On paper, this was supposed to reduce overcrowding and make the cell block safer. In reality, it created new dangers. The relocation was rushed. Many of the inmates were moved without proper medical evaluations, without mental health support, and without notification to their families. Cells were overcrowded. Staff were unprepared, and the violence that had plagued Unit 29 quickly spread to other areas. One transferred inmate wrote, "They moved us like cargo. Nobody cared if we survived the night." Reports of fights, stabbings, and assaults surged in the new units. Prison staff were overwhelmed, and tension among inmates skyrocketed. Meanwhile, the federal investigation revealed that the state had kept the relocation plan secret from the public and from oversight committees. Emails suggested officials feared criticism and wanted to avoid admitting that the prison system was still unsafe. Inside Unit 29, some men celebrated the small relief. Fewer inmates in their dorms, slightly cooler halls, but the sense of safety was short-lived. Everyone knew that as long as the system was broken, the nightmare could return at any moment. Families of inmates were outraged. Lawyers called the relocation a band-aid on a wound that's been left to fester for a century. And national media picked up the story, exposing once again that Mississippi's most dangerous cell block was far from reformed. Even after riots, leaks, and investigations, the worst truths about Unit 29 were still buried, until whistleblowers and investigative journalists uncovered decades of unreported deaths. Records obtained from internal databases, combined with letters smuggled out by inmates, painted a chilling picture. Men who died from untreated injuries or illness were listed as transferred or inactive. Fights resulting in severe injury were recorded as minor incidents. Some deaths were completely erased from official logs, leaving families without answers. One case, later confirmed by multiple sources, involved an inmate who had been attacked in the yard and left unattended for hours. By the time guards found him, he had already died. The death was logged as natural causes. Another report detailed a man with untreated infections who repeatedly asked for medical attention, eventually passing away in solitary confinement. His death was never reported publicly. Investigators also discovered that decades of overcrowding, broken plumbing, and faulty locks contributed directly to these fatalities. Unit 29 wasn't just dangerous, it was deadly. Families of the deceased expressed outrage. Mothers and siblings demanded answers. How many more must die before anyone cares? Civil rights lawyers argued that the state of Mississippi had violated the Eighth Amendment, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. They claimed that Unit 29's neglect was systemic, intentional, and ongoing. The revelations shocked the nation. Headlines described Unit 29 as a modern-day death row disguised as a prison. And yet, despite all the exposure, some officials continued to defend the system, claiming reforms were underway. Inside the walls, inmates reacted differently. Some cried. Some laughed bitterly. Some simply continued to survive, knowing that Unit 29's nightmare wasn't just history, but their daily reality. After decades of neglect, abuse, and hidden deaths, the pressure on Mississippi's Department of Corrections reached a breaking point. Federal investigations, lawsuits, and public outrage forced the state to act, or at least pretend to act. Some of the first steps included replacing top administrators responsible for Unit 29, increasing oversight from federal monitors, conducting emergency repairs to leaking roofs, broken locks, and flooded cells. But these changes were piecemeal, and insiders quickly realized they were too little, too late. Families of inmates began to file civil suits for wrongful death, negligence, and violations of constitutional rights. Lawyers called it the largest prison accountability case in Mississippi's history. For the inmates themselves, life in Unit 29 remained tense. The violence hadn't disappeared. The overcrowding hadn't vanished. But there was one subtle change. They were being watched more closely. Every complaint, every incident, was now documented, and federal monitors had access to the unit. Activists and reporters kept the spotlight on Parchman. Articles, interviews, and social media campaigns reminded the public. Unit 29 wasn't just a prison. It was a warning of what happens when systems fail completely. For the first time, inmates felt that someone outside the walls might actually fight for them. Some started documenting abuses themselves, writing letters, and secretly recording conditions to ensure that history could not be rewritten again. And slowly, the world began to see Unit 29 for what it truly was, a symbol of systemic failure, but also a story of resilience, survival, and the fight for justice. For the men who survived Unit 29, leaving the prison walls didn't mean leaving the nightmare behind. Some were released on parole, stepping back into a world that had moved on without them. Others were transferred to other facilities, carrying the scars of what they endured, both physical and mental. Many spoke of post-traumatic stress, insomnia, and deep mistrust of authority. One former inmate said, "Freedom feels strange, but the memories never leave. I hear the doors slamming in my sleep." Families described the struggle to help their loved ones adjust. Simple tasks, a conversation, a job, a quiet night at home, could trigger panic or rage, echoes of life in Unit 29. Yet, there were stories of resilience too. Some men became advocates, working with civil rights groups to push for prison reform. Others shared their experiences in letters, documentaries, and interviews, determined to ensure the horrors of Unit 29 were never forgotten. Journalists and researchers used these first-hand accounts to pressure the state for long-term reforms, better staffing, proper medical care, mental health support, and stricter oversight. Unit 29 had taken its toll, but the survivors' courage ensured the story could inspire change. Their voices became a lifeline for justice, a warning for any system that forgets the humanity of those behind bars. Unit 29 may have been the most notorious cell block in Mississippi, but its story is bigger than one prison. The revelations, lawsuits, and survivor testimonies forced changes across the entire state prison system, increased federal oversight of high-risk facilities, policies requiring proper medical and mental health care for inmates, stricter reporting requirements for violence and deaths, funding allocated to repair crumbling infrastructure in aging prisons. Advocates say the battle is far from over. While reforms have been implemented, many prisons still struggle with overcrowding, violence, and neglect. For the men who lived through Unit 29, the impact is permanent. Some still carry physical scars, others emotional trauma. Yet their voices have created a legacy, a warning, a lesson, and a call to action. Unit 29's story is a reminder that accountability, transparency, and justice matter, even behind the walls where few dare to look. Because change is possible, but only when people refuse to forget. If you found this story gripping, hit like right now. Make sure you subscribe and ring that bell, because the stories hidden behind prison walls are far from over. Comment below. Would you survive a day in Unit 29? Share this video to spread the truth, because the world needs to know what happens inside places like Parchman Prison. And remember, truth can't be locked away. Stay curious, stay aware, and I'll see you in the next story.